There are two photographs held in the archives of the Johnson County Historical Society in Mountain City, Tennessee. They are kept in the same acid-free sleeve, tucked behind a manila folder labeled simply Presnell 1919, as though the archivist who filed them could not decide which category they belonged to, evidence or mystery, or something that resists both words entirely. The first photograph was taken in the autumn of 1917 at a portrait studio in Johnson City, some 40 miles southwest of Mountain City, where the roads were better and the light through the studio windows fell at the right angle to make a young man look like the kind of person who deserved to be remembered. The subject is Amos Presnell, 22 years old, dressed in his United States Army uniform with the collar buttoned to the throat. He sits with the formal stiffness of a man who has been told to sit still and has obeyed, though his hands, you can see them resting on his knees, are not quite still. The fingers of his right hand are slightly curled, as if he had been reaching for something and stopped himself. His face is angular, with a jaw that suggests stubbornness and eyes that suggest something more complicated than stubbornness. There is a small scar above his left eyebrow, a pale crescent no larger than a fingernail that catches the studio light. He is not smiling. Men of his time and place did not smile for photographs, but there is something at the corners of his mouth. Not a smile, but the ghost of one, or perhaps its opposite. The particular expression of a man who knows something he's choosing not to say. The second photograph was taken in the fall of 1919, 2 years later, almost to the month, by Sheriff Buford Green of Johnson County, using a camera that the county had acquired for the purpose of documenting persons of interest. It is a less flattering image. The man in this photograph stands against the exterior wall of the Johnson County Courthouse, squinting slightly against the afternoon light. He wears a U.S. Army uniform that is clean but worn, the kind of uniform a man keeps because he has nothing else to wear. His face is thinner than the face in the 1917 portrait, or perhaps it only seems thinner because the photograph is taken in harsh natural light rather than the soft diffusion of a studio. There is a small scar above his left eyebrow. The scar catches the light in a way that makes it look, in this particular photograph, exactly like the scar in the first. The two photographs are not identical. Any careful observer would note differences in the set of the jaw, in the proportion of the forehead, in the way the ears lie against the skull. They are not identical, but they are close enough that when Luella Presnell, mother of Amos Presnell, was shown both photographs side by side in the parlor of her home on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1919, she looked at them for a long moment, set them down on the table with the careful deliberateness of a woman who is trying very hard to control her hands, and then fainted. When she came to, she wept, and through the weeping, she said, "You came back." Her husband, Jedidiah Presnell, stood in the doorway of the parlor during this entire scene. He had been standing there when his wife was shown the photographs. He was standing there when she fainted, and when she came back to herself, and when she said those 3 words. He saw everything his wife saw. He heard everything she said, and then he turned and walked back through the house, out the back door, into the yard, and never, not once for the rest of his long life, spoke another word about what he had seen. That silence would prove in time to be the most important testimony in the entire affair. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what Jedidiah Presnell's silence meant, you first have to understand the world in which it happened. A world that had been broken in several different ways at once, so thoroughly and so recently that the cracks hadn't even finished spreading yet. Johnson County, Tennessee, in September of 1919, was a place that had been remade by grief. This was not unusual. Most places in America in September of 1919 had been remade by grief. The Great War had ended 11 months earlier, and in those 11 months, the country had been trying to figure out how to absorb what had happened. Not just the losses, which were staggering, but the nature of the losses, which were unlike anything the nation had experienced before. The Meuse-Argonne offensive alone, the massive Allied push through northeastern France in the final weeks of the war, had killed more than 26,000 American soldiers and wounded nearly 100,000 more in 47 days of fighting. 26,000 men in 47 days. The numbers resist comprehension. They still resist it. And then, before the grief of the war had even begun to settle, the influenza came. The Spanish flu of 1918 and 1919 moved through Appalachian communities with particular ferocity, partly because of the density of the population in the narrow mountain valleys, and partly because so many of the men who had served overseas came home carrying the virus in their lungs before they even knew they were sick. In Johnson County, the records are incomplete. They almost always are, in small rural counties in that era. But the estimates suggest that somewhere between 1 in 8 and 1 in 10 of the population died in the space of 18 months. That is the kind of statistic that you can say in a sentence and still not understand. 1 in 10. Look at the people around you. Pick one of every 10. That was Johnson County in 1919. The mountains themselves seem to participate in the strangeness of the era. Iron Mountain, which dominates the eastern skyline of Johnson County, rising to nearly 4,000 feet along the Virginia border, had long been known for peculiarities that locals attributed variously to the iron ore deposits in its geology, to something older and less easily named, or to the general disposition of mountains to do as they pleased. Compasses behaved oddly near Iron Mountain's northern ridges. Animals sometimes refused to cross certain draws on its lower slopes. There were documented reports, going back decades, of lights seen moving along its summit on clear nights. Lights that could not be explained by lanterns or fires, that moved too fast and too silently for human agency. The geological explanation, the magnetic anomalies created by concentrated iron deposits interfering with the Earth's normal field, was well established by 1919. But the geological explanation does not entirely account for the feeling that the mountain generated in the people who lived beneath it. A feeling that was not quite fear and not quite awe, but occupied the uncomfortable space between them. It was into this landscape, into this specific mixture of fresh grief and unresolved trauma and mountain strangeness, that a man walked on a Tuesday morning in September of 1919. He came into Hartley's General Store in Mountain City at approximately 9 in the morning, according to the account later given by Owen Hartley, the store's proprietor, who was stocking shelves behind the counter when the bell above the door announced a customer. Hartley turned and saw a man he had never seen before, a man in a U.S. Army uniform, carrying a small canvas bag, with the look of someone who had been walking for a while. The man set his bag on the floor near the door and stood for a moment, looking around the store with an expression that Hartley later described with the particular imprecision of someone trying to describe something that doesn't have a good word, as like a man looking for something he wasn't sure was still there. Then the man said, "Mr. Hartley, is my mother still getting her flour from you on account?" Owen Hartley was not a man easily unsettled. He had run the general store for 22 years. He had extended credit to half the county and refused it to the other half, and had developed, over those decades, the thick, pragmatic skin of a man who has seen enough human need and human disappointment that very little surprises him anymore. But this surprised him, because Owen Hartley had never seen this man before in his life. And yet the man knew his name, and the man knew about the flour account, and the man knew, as Owen Hartley would realize in a moment when the specific name of the account came back to him, that the flour account in question belonged to Luella Presnell. "Boy," said Owen Hartley, setting down the can of peaches he had been holding, "who are you?" The man looked at him steadily. "You know who I am," he said. "You gave me a peppermint stick the morning I left for the train. You told me to come back in one piece." Owen Hartley's face, by his own later account, went through several expressions in rapid succession. He had given a peppermint stick to Amos Presnell on the morning of his departure in the autumn of 1917. He had said almost exactly those words. He had not told anyone the story that he could recall in the 2 years since. It was a small moment, one of thousands of small moments that accumulate around a war without anyone specifically deciding to remember them. He had simply done it. And then Amos had gone. And then the telegram had come. And now 2 years had passed. "Amos Presnell is dead," Owen Hartley said. "I know what people think," the man said. "I need to see my mother." The town of Mountain City, Tennessee, in 1919, had a population of perhaps 800 souls, and it shared with every small town of that size and era the quality of perfect informational permeability, which is to say that news traveled through it the way water travels through limestone, finding every crack and fissure until there is no part of the structure that hasn't been touched. By noon, on the day, the man walked into Hartley's general store. There was not a person in Mountain City who had not heard that someone was claiming to be Amos Presnell. The reactions divided almost immediately along lines that would prove remarkably stable over the months that followed. There were those who believed. These were primarily, though not exclusively, women. Luella Presnell's circle. The women who had sat with her through the grief of the telegram, who had watched her diminish in the 2 years since, who wanted with a fierceness that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with love for her grief to end. Among this group, the man's knowledge of intimate details that emerged through the afternoon as he made his way, quietly and without fanfare, to the Presnell farm on the east edge of town, seemed not just persuasive, but conclusive. He knew the name of the family's dog, a brindlehound named Josiah, who was going on 12 years old and had been Amos's dog since boyhood. He knew that Luella kept a tin of horehound candy in the second drawer of the kitchen dresser, behind the good napkins. He knew that the back step had always squeaked on the left side, and that Jedidiah had promised to fix it every spring for 15 years, and never had. He knew these things, not in the way that a man who has studied for a role might know them, with a certain careful deliberateness, consulting an interior list, but in the easy, unself-conscious way that a person knows the furniture of their own life. He walked into the Presnell house like a man walking into his own house, and the specific quality of that ease was, for the believers, the most convincing thing of all. Luella Presnell opened the door and looked at the man standing on her porch for perhaps 3 seconds. Then she made a sound that people who heard it would later struggle to describe. Not a word, not quite a scream. Something prior to both of those, something that came from before language. And she put her arms around him and held on. The dog was the second thing people talked about. Josiah, the old brindle hound, was sleeping on the porch when the man arrived. He was a dog well past his useful years, mostly deaf, mostly blind, navigating the world by smell and by the geography of a familiar space. But when the man came through the gate, Josiah lifted his head. And then he did something that no one present had seen him do in years. He got to his feet. He crossed the porch on stiff, uncertain legs, and when the man crouched down, Josiah pressed his face into the man's hands and made, very quietly, the particular sound that dogs make only for the people they love most. Owen Hartley, who had followed the man from his store at a distance and was watching from the road, said later, "I have kept dogs all my life. I know what that looks like." But there were also those who did not believe, and their objections were not trivial. Sheriff Buford Green was 44 years old in 1919, a big, slow-moving man with a reputation for thoroughness that had been earned over 15 years of careful, unexciting law enforcement in a county where careful and unexciting law enforcement was generally what was called for. He had been sheriff since 1904. He had handled disputes over land and livestock and inheritance and the occasional violent eruption of whatever dark thing lives in men and sometimes surfaces when the whiskey is wrong or the debt is too heavy. He was not, by temperament or training, a man inclined toward mystery. When he heard that someone was claiming to be Amos Presnell, he did not say, "How strange." He said, "Who is this man, and where did he come from?" His first action, within hours of the man's arrival, was to send a telegram to the War Department in Washington asking for confirmation of the death of Sergeant Amos Presnell, Company C, 117th Infantry Regiment, 30th Division. He did not expect the answer to be anything other than what it was. Amos Presnell had died on October 8, 1918, at the Meuse-Argonne offensive near the village of Briols-sur-Meuse in the Meuse Valley of northeastern France. His death had been confirmed by his commanding officer, Captain William Lawson. His body had been identified and buried at the American Military Cemetery at Romain-sous-Montfaucon. Grave, Section D, Row 4, Plot 17. The American Battle Monuments Commission had the records. The grave was real. The grave had a marker with his name on it. Amos Presnell was, by every official measure, dead. Green's second action was to take the man's fingerprints. Fingerprinting in rural Tennessee in 1919 was not the routine procedure it would later become, but it was not unknown. The technique had been in use by American law enforcement since the early years of the century, and Green had learned the basics of it from a manual sent by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. He inked the man's fingers carefully and pressed them to a card. Then he sent a request to the War Department for whatever fingerprint records might exist for Amos Presnell. The answer that came back was, in its own way, as strange as everything else about the case. The War Department did have a fingerprint card on file for Sergeant Amos Presnell. The card had been created as part of the identification protocols implemented after 1917. But the card was partially smudged. The index finger and ring finger of the right hand were illegible, and the middle finger of the left hand was unclear. Of the prints that could be compared, Green's analysis, which he performed himself with the manual and a magnifying glass, showed what he described as points of similarity and points of divergence. Not a match, not a clear mismatch. Something in between, which, given the quality of both the records and the methodology, was almost more frustrating than either definitive answer would have been. Green wrote in his report, "The fingerprint evidence is inconclusive. I cannot say with certainty that this man is not Amos Presnell. I cannot say with certainty that he is." The third thing Green noticed, and the one that would weigh most heavily on him in the weeks that followed, was the battle knowledge. Or rather, the lack of it. When Green sat down with the man and asked him about the war, about his unit, about the officers he had served under, about the Meuse Argonne, about the specific circumstances of the day he was supposed to have died, the man's answers were strange. Not wrong, exactly. He knew the name of his regiment. He knew the name of Captain Lawson. He knew the general shape of the offensive. But the granular details, the specific terrain features, the names of the men in his section, the small accumulated texture of 18 months of military service, these came haltingly, or not at all. When pressed, the man grew agitated in a way that Green recognized, having seen it in other veterans that year. The particular agitation of a man whose memories are not simply absent but hidden from himself, locked behind something that looks from the outside like forgetfulness, but feels from the inside like a door that won't open. Shell shock? Green asked Dr. Calvin Duggar, the county physician, who had also served as an army doctor in France and had come home with his own set of locked doors and things he didn't discuss. "Could be," said Duggar. "The condition presents differently in different men. Some men lose specific memories. Some lose entire spans of time. Some lose other things." He paused. "There are men in veterans' hospitals who don't remember their own names." "He remembers his name," Green said. "Yes," said Duggar. "That's one of the interesting things." Della Reese lived in a house half a mile south of the Presnell farm, which meant she had been Amos's neighbor before she was his fiancée, and his fiancée before the war, and something more complicated than either of those things after the telegram came. She was 20 years old when Amos left for France in 1917, and 22 when the telegram said he was not coming back. She had mourned. She had kept mourning past the point where people expected her to stop. And then, gradually, she had done what people who survive do, which is to say she had gone on living. And living had brought her, as it had a way of doing, into proximity with someone who cared for her. Thomas Harmon was a farmer's son from the north end of the county, 25 years old, a man who had been deemed unfit for military service due to a childhood injury to his left hand that had healed imperfectly and left 3 fingers with limited mobility. He was decent and hardworking, and had the particular quality of steadiness that becomes, after long grief, more appealing than it might otherwise be. Della had not announced an engagement. She had not made any formal acknowledgement of what was developing between her and Thomas Harmon. But the county knew. In Mountain City, the county always knew. When the man who claimed to be Amos Presnell walked into town, Della Reese was among the last people to go see him. She let the first day pass, and the second. On the third day, she went to the Presnell farm. Later, asked to describe what happened when she arrived, she was careful with her words, in a way that suggested she was being careful for reasons she wasn't fully explaining. She said that the man looked at her with an expression she recognized, not just the general expression of recognition, but something more specific, something that she said belonged to Amos, a particular way he had of looking at her when he was trying not to show that he was hurt. She said this without elaboration, and people who heard it understood without asking what she meant. There had been something between them in those last weeks before his deployment, some unresolved thing, and this man's face carried the memory of it. But she also said that something was wrong. She said she couldn't name it. She said it wasn't any one thing she could point to. It was more like she searched for the word, like talking to a translation of a person, not the original, not a forgery exactly, something between. She left the farm after an hour and went home and did not visit again for 3 weeks. Thomas Harmon said nothing about any of this, publicly. Privately, to his brother, and to no one else, he said, "I don't think it matters whether he's Amos Presnell or not. What matters is what she decides." This was, for Thomas Harmon, a remarkably perceptive thing to say. It would also prove, in time, to be remarkably accurate. The first week of October brought more testimony, more detail, more evidence pointing in contradictory directions. A cousin of Amos's named Franklin Presnell, who had grown up alongside Amos and claimed to know him as well as any person alive, went to see the man and came away shaken. "He knew things," Franklin said. "He knew about the summer we got into the church whiskey and blamed it on each other. He knew which one of us it was that actually did it. Nobody knew that, not even our mothers." He paused. "But he didn't move right. Amos had a way of moving. You know how you know a man by the way he moves? He didn't move like Amos." A woman named Cora McBride, who had taught Amos in school, said the man's handwriting was different. Amos had written in a distinctive, slightly back-slanting script that she recognized from years of marking his compositions. She asked the man to write a sentence. He wrote in a forward-slanting hand. She looked at it for a moment and said, "That's not Amos's writing." The man said that his writing had changed after an injury to his right hand in France. He showed her a scar across the palm of his right hand, not the same scar documented in his military records, which described a mark on the wrist. A different scar, newer looking. And there was something else, something that emerged slowly as people spent time with the man and compared notes. He had a surgical scar on his left side, below the rib cage, roughly 4 inches long, and clearly the work of a skilled hand rather than a battlefield wound. Nobody who knew Amos remembered this scar. When asked about it, the man said he didn't know where it had come from, that it had been there when he woke up, wherever he had been, and nobody had explained it. This answer satisfied no one. It was the kind of answer that seems in retrospect, more honest than a better answer would have been. Sheriff Green was still telegraphing. He had sent messages to the War Department, to the American Battle Monuments Commission, to the headquarters of the 30th Division, to the veterans' hospitals in Virginia and North Carolina. The responses accumulated on his desk: confirmations of death, roster, records, casualty reports. He read through them with the careful attention of a man looking for the one detail that would settle things. He did not find it. What he found instead was a name. In a roster of the 117th Infantry Regiment's Company C, the same company as Amos Presnell, there appeared a private named Robert Estep from Wise County, Virginia, enlisted in 1917, wounded at the Meuse-Argonne on October 7th, 1918. One day before Amos Presnell's recorded death. Robert Estep had been hospitalized at the American Expeditionary Forces Field Hospital, then transferred to a military hospital in Le Havre, then transferred again, months later, to a veterans psychiatric facility in Roanoke, Virginia. The Roanoke facility's records, when Green finally obtained them, showed that Robert Estep had been admitted in March of 1919 for what the admitting physician described as acute identity dissociation secondary to traumatic stress, presenting with confusion regarding personal identity and the adoption of characteristics of other individuals. He had been placed in a therapeutic program. He had shown improvement. He had, in July of 1919, walked out of the facility and not returned. Wise County, Virginia, was approximately 60 miles from Mountain City, Tennessee. Following the mountain roads, Green wrote this information in his report, and then sat with it for a long time, looking out the window of his office at the autumn light on the courthouse square, trying to decide what it meant. On one reading, it meant everything. Here was a man, Robert Estep, who had served in the same company as Amos Presnell, who had been hospitalized for identity confusion, who had escaped a veterans hospital months before the claimant appeared in Mountain City. The geography fit. The timing fit. The medical history offered a framework, a disturbing one, but a framework for how a man might come to believe he was someone he was not. On another reading, it meant almost nothing. Knowing Robert Estep existed did not prove that the man in Mountain City was Robert Estep. And even if it did, that didn't fully explain the things the man knew. The flower account, the peppermint stick, the whorehound candy, the squeaking step, Franklin Presnell's secret about the church whiskey. Robert Estep was from Wise County, Virginia. How would Robert Estep know these things? Green went to see Dr. Duggar. Calvin Duggar's office occupied the front room of his house on Main Street, and it smelled of carbolic acid and the pipe tobacco that Duggar had been smoking since his 30s and would continue smoking until his death. He was 51 years old in 1919, a lean, precise man who had studied medicine at Vanderbilt and had come home to practice in the county where he was born because he had decided, somewhere in the middle of his education, that the people who needed a careful doctor most were not the people in the cities. He had gone to France as a military physician in 1917 and had spent 14 months performing surgery in conditions that his Vanderbilt professors had not prepared him for, and he had come home changed in ways he did not often discuss. What he had not left behind, in France or elsewhere, was his curiosity. When Green presented him with the accumulating strangeness of the Presnell case, Duggar listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him, and then was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for him in a different way. tell me again about the dog," he said. Green described Josiah's reaction, the rising from sleep, the crossing of the porch, the pressing of the face into the man's hands. "And the mother," Duggar said, "not just the belief, the specific things she noticed." Green described Luella's testimony, the way the man carried himself, the particular sound of his voice when he was quiet, a habit he had of touching his collar when he was thinking, which had been Amos's habit since boyhood. Duggar refilled his pipe. "Are you familiar with the work coming out of the shell-shock literature in Europe?" he asked. "The neurological literature, specifically?" Green was not. "There is a school of thought," Duggar said, "still controversial, still being argued about, but supported by more evidence than the mainstream wants to acknowledge. That trauma, at sufficient intensity, can do things to human memory and human identity that we don't have adequate language for yet. Not just suppress memory, not just confuse it, actually reorganize it." He paused. "There are documented cases in France and Britain of men who survived severe battlefield trauma and woke up with what appeared to be memories that were not their own. Men who recalled, with complete conviction and extensive detail, experiences that belonged to other soldiers, dead soldiers, in some cases, men they had known." "You're saying he absorbed Amos's memories," Green said flatly. "I'm saying the literature suggests the possibility," Duggar said. "I'm not saying it explains the dog. I have no explanation for the dog." He looked at his pipe. "I have no explanation for how a man from Wise County, Virginia, knows that Owen Hartley gave Amos Presnell a peppermint stick on the morning he left. No theory of memory accounts for that." "Unless he is Amos Presnell," Green said. "Unless he is Amos Presnell," Duggar agreed. "In which case, we are back where we started, and the grave in France contains someone else." They sat with that for a while. Outside, the October light was thinning toward the quality it gets in the mountains in late afternoon, going amber and then going dark fast, the way it does when the ridges are close. It was around this time, the second week of October, that Green hired a private investigator. His name was Cecil Barton, and he worked out of Johnson City, and he had a reputation for thoroughness and a manner that people tended to underestimate because he was small and quiet and looked, as Green's deputy once said, like a man you'd forget about the minute he left the room. This quality, as Barton had long since recognized, was among the most useful professional assets a private investigator could have. Barton spent 3 weeks on the case. He went to Wise County, Virginia, and found Robert Estep's family. He went to the Veterans Hospital in Roanoke and obtained, by means he preferred not to specify in writing, a copy of Robert Estep's admission records and the treatment notes that accompanied them. He went to the American Battle Monuments Commission's records office in Washington and cross-referenced casualty reports. He went back to Mountain City and spent time watching the man who called himself Amos Presnell, not interviewing him, just watching, the way you watch something you're trying to understand at the level below language. His report, which Green received in early November, was 17 pages long and was, in its way, a masterpiece of the investigator's art. It contained a great deal of information, all of it relevant, and it reached a conclusion that was at once definitive and entirely unsatisfying. The definitive part, the man in Mountain City, was almost certainly Robert Estep. Barton had obtained a physical description from Estep's family and from hospital records, and the description matched the claimant in every measurable particular: height, weight, eye color, a birthmark on the right forearm that the Estep family described and the claimant possessed. Barton had spoken to Robert Estep's mother, a widow in Wise County, who wept when shown a description of the man in Mountain City and said her son had been missing since July. The unsatisfying part, none of this explained what needed to be explained. Barton, to his credit, said so directly. "If this man is Robert Estep," he wrote, "then the question of how Robert Estep came to possess information known only to Amos Presnell, information about the Presnell family's private life, about events that occurred in Mountain City before the war, about details that even Amos Presnell's closest friends did not know, this question has no satisfactory answer. The theory of identity dissociation, as explained to me by Dr. Duggar, suggests that Estep may have internalized Presnell's memories through some mechanism that is not yet fully understood. This theory is speculative. It does not explain the dog." He wrote those last 4 words as a separate sentence, as though he wanted them to stand alone. It does not explain the dog. Barton also noted in a section of his report that Green found himself rereading several times what he had observed about the man during his weeks of watching. "He is not performing," Barton wrote. "I have watched men perform roles in my professional capacity for 20 years. I know the quality of performance, the slight over-precision, the occasional hesitation, the way a man will sometimes, for just a moment, forget that he is supposed to be someone else. I do not see this in him. When he walks into the Presnell house and goes to the kitchen and pours himself water from the specific pitcher on the specific shelf where the pitcher has been kept for 20 years, he does not remember where the pitcher is. He knows where the pitcher is. There is a difference. I cannot account for it. The late autumn deepened into a Johnson County winter, which means the ridges went bare and the color left the landscape, and the cold came in with the particular authority of mountain cold, which doesn't negotiate. The man who called himself Amos Presnell had moved into the Presnell house. Luella had insisted. She had given him back his old room, and he had slept in his old bed. And in the mornings she cooked him the same breakfast she had cooked for Amos since he was small. Eggs fried in lard, cornbread, coffee so strong it amounted to a theological statement. The neighbors watched. The county watched. Sheriff Green watched. Jedidiah Presnell said nothing. This silence was becoming, by degrees, its own kind of statement. A man who believed his dead son had come back would say something. A man who believed an impostor was sleeping in his dead son's bed would say something. Indeed, would likely do considerably more than say something. Jedidiah's silence suggested a third position, one that didn't have a clean name, and it was beginning to weigh on Green in a way that the other questions, as complex as they were, did not. On a Thursday evening in November, Green went to the Presnell farm and asked to speak with Jedidiah alone. They sat on the porch despite the cold, because neither man was the kind of man who had the conversation he needed to have with walls around him. Jedidiah was 63 years old, a big, weathered man who had worked this land for 40 years and had the kind of physical authority that comes not from size alone, but from the specific confidence of a person whose relationship with the physical world is direct and unambiguous. He grew things. He fixed things. He understood cause and effect in the vocabulary of soil and timber and the turning of seasons. The ambiguity of the past 2 months had been, for him, a kind of suffering that he had no tools for. "You're not going to tell me it's not him," Green said. It wasn't a question. Jedidiah looked at the dark ridge of Iron Mountain against the last of the evening light. "I'm not going to tell you it is him either," he said. "You know something," Green said. "You've known it since the start. That's why you went quiet." A long silence, the kind of silence that contains something. "Amos was going to leave," Jedidiah said finally. "Not just for the war. Before the war, he had it in his head to go to France. Just go. Not as a soldier. He'd been writing letters to a girl there. A French girl he'd found in one of those pen pal programs the church was running. It had gone on for 2 years. He stopped. "I found the letters. In the spring of 1917, before he enlisted. He had it planned out. Was going to save money, go over, see if something came of it." He stopped again. "When the war started, he enlisted instead. I thought maybe the plan had died with the war." Green waited. "But I think," Jedidiah said, slowly, as if the words were something he was constructing rather than recalling, "I think he might have gone through with it. After the armistice. I think maybe my son, the original, the real one, whatever you want to call him, maybe he survived the war and then just stayed. Didn't come home. Let the army think what they thought. Started over." He looked at his hands. "The grave in France might be a mistake. A misidentification. There were a lot of those at the end of the Argonne. A lot of them." "Or," Green said. "Or the grave is right," Jedidiah said. "And this man in my house is not my son. And somehow he knows everything about my son's life. And my wife has her son back. Whichever one is true." "Which do you think it is?" Green asked. Jedidiah was quiet for so long that Green thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "I think both things are true. I think Amos decided to leave us, and I think Amos is dead. And I think those two facts can live together without either one canceling the other." He stood up from his chair with the deliberate care of a man whose joints have opinions about the cold. "I'm going inside. You can do whatever you need to do, Buford. But I want you to know that whatever that man in there is, he has been kind to my wife, and she is happy, and I'm not going to let the truth, whatever it is, take that from her." He went inside. He did not look back. The French pen pal, when Green finally tracked her down through a painstaking chain of correspondence that took most of the winter, was a woman named Madeleine Bouchard, 24 years old, living in the village of Givet in the Ardennes department of northern France, approximately 80 miles from the Meuse-Argonne battlefield. She had been exchanging letters with a young American man named Amos Presnell since 1915, when her church's international correspondence program had been matched with a similar program run by a Methodist congregation in Johnson City, Tennessee. The letters had become, over 2 years, something well beyond the modest religious exchange they had begun as. Green's letter to her, translated by a school teacher in Johnson City who had studied French, asked whether she had had any contact with Amos Presnell after the armistice. The answer, which arrived in March of 1920, 6 months after the original inquiry, was written in careful English that suggested she had taken considerable trouble with it. She wrote, "Your question causes me both hope and sadness, which is a combination I have not felt before. Yes, a man came to Give in the winter of 1918 after the armistice. He said he was Amos Presnell. He stayed for 3 months. He was not the same man I had come to know through the letters. He was quieter, and there were things he could not remember that Amos had told me of. But he knew Amos's letters by heart. He knew things that only someone who had read them could know. In the spring of 1919, he left. I do not know where he went. I asked him not to go. He said he had to find out who he was. She wrote, I do not know if the man who came to give it was Amos Presnell. I know that I loved Amos Presnell through his letters. I know that the man who came was kind and was broken in some way that was familiar, the way men who came back from the front were broken. I know that he sat very still sometimes and looked at nothing, and that when I asked what he was seeing, he said he was not sure. I know that I have not stopped thinking about him. Green read this letter 4 times. He filed it with the rest of the documents. He did not know what to do with it, which was a feeling he had grown accustomed to in this case. The letter from Madeleine Bouchard introduced a new possibility, one that Cecil Barton, when informed of it, said he should have considered earlier. What if the man who came to Give had been Robert Estep, already in the process of becoming Amos Presnell? What if he had gone to France not on any conscious plan, but because the Presnell memories he had absorbed or believed or inhabited had drawn him there? Had drawn him to the one person who knew Amos Presnell only through letters, and therefore might be fooled by a version of Amos who knew those letters, but didn't quite move right, didn't quite feel right, had gaps in the texture of his presence? And what if, in those 3 months in Givet, the transformation had deepened? What if Madeleine Bouchard's genuine grief, her genuine connection to the person she had known through 2 years of letters, had somehow given the man who called himself Amos permission to become him more completely? Barton wrote in a follow-up note to his original report, I have been in this business a long time. I have seen men become other men, deliberately, for money or safety or escape. I have never before encountered a case in which I could not determine whether the becoming was deliberate or not. This man, if he is Robert Estep, may not know he is Robert Estep. He may be performing no deception at all, in any meaningful sense of the word. He may simply be Amos Presnell, not in origin, but in some other way that I don't have vocabulary for. The winter of 1919 and 1920 passed in Mountain City, with the man in residence at the Presnell farm, living as Amos Presnell, working the farm alongside Jedidiah, attending church with Luella, nodding to neighbors in the street. The county's divisions did not resolve so much as calcify. The believers continued to believe, the doubters continued to doubt, and the majority of people, as is usually the case, occupied the uncomfortable middle ground of not being sure what they thought and wishing someone would make the decision for them. Della Reese came back to the Presnell farm in December. She came alone on a Tuesday afternoon and asked to speak with him privately. What they said to each other in that conversation was never reported. What was observed by Luella from the kitchen window was that they sat on the porch for over an hour, and that at one point Della put her face in her hands, and that the man sat very still beside her and did not reach out to touch her, which Luella said later was the most Amos thing about the whole scene. Amos always knew when not to reach for you. Della did not end her relationship with Thomas Harmon. She did not resume her engagement with the man who called himself Amos. She existed in a suspended state for the rest of the winter, present in the town, maintaining both connections without resolving either, waiting for something to clarify that did not clarify. Thomas Harmon said nothing public. He continued to court her, steadily and without drama, which may have been the wisest thing he could have done. In April of 1920, at the request of several of Amos Presnell's relatives who wanted the matter formally resolved, Sheriff Green convened what he called a county hearing. Not a trial, because no crime had been definitively identified, but a formal proceeding in which evidence would be presented and testimony taken, and some determination, however imperfect, would be attempted. The hearing was held in the Johnson County Courthouse on a Wednesday morning in the second week of April. The room was full. People had come from across the county and from neighboring counties in both Tennessee and Virginia. They sat in the wooden pews that served the courthouse audience space, and they were, by all accounts, very quiet. The particular quiet of people who sense that what they are about to witness matters in a way that is difficult to articulate. Sheriff Green presented the evidence in the same careful order he had assembled it over the previous 7 months. The War Department's confirmation of death, the burial records from Romagne-sous-Montfaucon, the fingerprint comparison and its inconclusiveness, the private investigator's findings regarding Robert Estep, the medical records describing Estep's identity dissociation, the geographical and temporal alignment with the claimant's arrival in Mountain City, the letter from Madeleine Bouchard, the surgical scar that no one could explain, then the testimonies. Owen Hartley, describing the peppermint stick and the flower account, and the quality of certainty with which the man had known these things. Franklin Presnell, describing the church whiskey, secret and the thing about the way he moved. Cora McBride, describing the handwriting, and the explanation about the hand injury. Luella Presnell, describing the fainting and the weeping, and the 47 years of knowing her son, and the recognition that had struck her like light when she opened her door. The man himself testified. He sat in the witness chair, with the same steadiness he had maintained throughout 7 months of scrutiny, and answered every question that was put to him in a voice that did not waver. He said he was Amos Presnell. He said he knew this in the way a person knows their own name, not because of evidence, but because it was simply true. He said he did not know what had happened to his memories of the war, and that the gaps frightened him, but that the absence of some memories did not mean the absence of all truth. He said that when he walked into the house where he grew up, he felt it in his body, before he felt it in his mind. The specific pressure of a known space, the exact angle of the light through the kitchen windows, the sound of the boards under his feet, and that this knowing was more real to him than anything anyone had told him about who he was or was not. "How do you explain the evidence against you?" Green asked. "I can't explain records," the man said. "I can only tell you what I know. Records can be wrong. I was there. I know what I know." Several of Amos's Army comrades from the 117th Infantry had come to testify. 2 of them said they recognized him. The one added the qualifier that he'd aged considerably and looked different in ways he couldn't entirely account for. One of them, a man named Willis Slagle from Elizabethton, who had been in the same section as Amos during the early part of the Meuse Argonne, said flatly that this was not Amos Presnell. Said Amos had been a man who talked too much, who told stories compulsively, who had a habit of reenacting things with his hands while he described them. "This man," said Willis Slagle, looking at the claimant across the courtroom, "doesn't talk the same. Something's different." The claimant looked back at Willis Slagle and said, "You used to sing hymns in your sleep. It drove us all crazy. You sang Rock of Ages every night for 3 months." Willis Slagle's face went through something. He looked down. He didn't say anything else. Dr. Duggar testified about shell shock and dissociative identity conditions, about the European literature and what it suggested, about the ways in which trauma could restructure a person's relationship to their own history. He was careful to say that he was not diagnosing either the claimant or the absent Robert Estep, and that the science was not settled, and that he could not say definitively what had happened. But he said that the symptom profile, as described, the confident assumption of another identity, the possession of intimate details belonging to that identity, the gaps in other memories, the complete absence of performance affect, was consistent with what the literature called a dissociative fugue state of unusual persistence and depth. "These cases are rare," he said, "but they are documented. A man, under sufficient trauma, can lose himself and find someone else in his place, and the finding can be completely genuine. He is not lying. He is not pretending. He has simply become, in whatever way we understand becoming, someone else." "Or he was always who he says he was," said the claimant's attorney, a young man from Johnson City named Harris, who had taken the case pro bono because he found it interesting. "And the records are wrong, which they were often wrong in that war, in those conditions, and the fingerprints are inconclusive, which they are, and the physical evidence supports his identity, which it does." No determination was reached that day. The hearing was recessed. 2 days later, Jedidiah Presnell asked to address the court. He was given the floor on a Friday morning. He sat down in the witness chair with the careful deliberateness of a man who has spent a long time deciding what he is going to say and has decided that he is going to say it once, clearly, and not again. The room was quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before, a held breath quiet, the kind that happens when everyone present understands that what comes next will be the thing they remember. Jedidiah Presnell looked at the man who called himself his son. He looked for a long time. The man looked back. They held each other's gaze in a way that everyone watching would later say they could not describe, that it was not the look of a father and son who recognize each other, and not the look of strangers, and was something they had no word for. Then Jedidiah spoke. He said, "I don't know if this is my son. I have sat with that question for 7 months, and I do not have an answer, and I am not going to have one." He paused. "I have watched this man work my land. He works the way Amos worked, not just the technique of it, but the disposition, the way he approaches a problem, the way he stops and looks at something before he acts." Another pause. "My wife is happy. She has not been happy in 2 years. She is happy now." He looked down at his hands. "I found letters. Amos's letters to a French girl. He was going to leave us. He had decided to leave long before the war gave him the occasion to go. I don't know whether he left in peace or in a box. I don't know whether the grave in France is his or some other man's. I don't know whether the man in my house is my son or someone who has become my son or something that doesn't have a name yet. He looked up and he looked at the room and he said, "But I know this. My son is dead. Whichever thing is true, my son is dead. If he died in France, he is dead. If he survived France and chose to stay in France and let us grieve him, that man is dead too. The man who would do that is not the Amos Presnell I raised. Either way, what I had is gone." He stopped. He looked back at the man in the witness chair. "And this man, whoever he is, this man has been kind to my wife, and he has worked my land, and he has kept his word in every small thing since he came here, and he has not been cruel." He was quiet. "I'm not asking the court to decide anything. I'm telling you what I know. I know my son is dead, and I know this man is here. And I don't know any more than that, and I don't think anyone else in this room does either." He stood up and walked back to his seat and did not speak again during the proceedings. The county hearing reached no conclusion. Judge Elmore Blevins, who had presided, issued a statement saying that the evidence was insufficient to either confirm or deny the claimant's identity, that no crime had been proven, and that the matter was being closed, pending new evidence. He recommended that the family be left to make their own determination, as was their right, and that the community respect whatever determination they made. It was, in the fullest sense of the word, inconclusive. And the man who called himself Amos Presnell went home to the Presnell farm, and he stayed. He stayed for 1 year, and then for 10, and then for 20. He worked the land alongside Jedidiah until Jedidiah died in 1934, and then he worked it alone, and then with hired help when his own body began to register the decades. He cared for Luella through the long diminishment of her old age, was with her when she died in 1941, buried her in the churchyard as her son. He attended church, paid his taxes, sat on the porch in the evenings, helped neighbors when help was needed, was a decent and unremarkable presence in a small community for 4 decades. Della Reese married Thomas Harmon in June of 1921. They had 3 children. She lived until 1978. For the rest of her life, she was known in the community as a woman who never spoke about the Presnell matter, who would, if the subject came up in her presence, become very still in a specific way that caused people to change the subject. What she had decided during those months of suspended state, what she had concluded in the long December conversation on the porch, what she had understood about the man and about herself and about the nature of knowing someone, she took with her. Thomas Harmon died in 1969. Whatever he thought about it, he kept to himself. He was, in this as in most things, steady. The man who called himself Amos Presnell died on a February morning in 1960, in his bed, in the Presnell house where he had lived for 41 years. He was 64 years old, or 66, depending on which birth record you consulted, and they didn't entirely agree. He had been attended through his final weeks by Dr. Calvin Duggar's son, the elder Duggar having died in 1952, and had been peaceful in the manner of a man who has made his peace. He was buried in the Mountain City churchyard, in the plot that the Presnell family had held for generations, under a stone that read Amos, Purnell, 1896 to 1960. Beloved son, in the American Military Cemetery at Romagne-sous-Montfaucon in France. In Section D, Row 4, Plot 17, there stands a white marble cross bearing the same name. 2 stones, 2 continents, 1 name. The case might have ended there, a strange chapter in a small county's history, talked about at family dinners and in barber shops for a generation, then fading to the status of legend that people half believe and half dismiss, like all the strangest true things eventually do. But in 1997, a granddaughter of Franklin Presnell, a woman named Sandra Presnell Cole, who had grown up hearing the story and had spent years in its shadow, submitted a formal request for DNA testing to determine whether the man buried in the Mountain City churchyard was biologically related to the Presnell family. Sandra had no children, had never married, and had a researcher's temperament and a descendant's need to know. She hired a lawyer. She obtained permission to exhume. She worked through the necessary channels with the patience and persistence of a woman who had been thinking about this for a long time. The testing was conducted by a laboratory at Vanderbilt University. The results came back in November of 1997. They were sealed. The Presnell family, in a brief statement released through Sandra Cole's lawyer, said that the family had received the results and had decided, after careful consideration, not to make them public. No further statement was issued. Sandra Cole declined all interviews on the subject. She died in 2019 at the age of 71, and if she left any private record of what the results had shown, it has not been found. The sealed results have been the subject of speculation ever since, and the speculation divides, as everything about this case divides, into camps that say contradictory things. Some say the family sealed the results because they confirmed that the buried man was not biologically a Presnell, that he was Robert Estep or some other person, and the family chose grief over truth, chose the 41 years of living as Amos over the forensic undoing of it. Some say the family sealed the results because they confirmed the opposite, that the buried man was biologically related to the Presnell line, and that this confirmation was too difficult to reconcile with the known evidence of the grave in France. And so, the family chose silence over the particular kind of chaos that a positive match would have created. Some say the results were inconclusive. Some say they were contaminated. Some say Sandra Cole sealed them, not because of what they showed, but because she understood, after decades of carrying the question, that an answer would not resolve anything, would only change the shape of the mystery, not dissolve it. There is no evidence that favors any of these interpretations over the others. There is only the silence. It is the silence that brings us, finally, to what this story is actually about. Because the mystery of whether the man was Amos Presnell or Robert Estep or some third thing, while genuinely remarkable, while historically documented and meticulously evidenced and strange enough to resist every framework we apply to it, is not, in the end, the thing that carries the most weight. The thing that carries the most weight is what Jedidiah Presnell said in that courtroom. I know my son is dead. He meant it as a statement about reality, but it is also a statement about the nature of identity, about what a person actually is when you strip away the records and the fingerprints and the graves and the DNA. A person is a continuous set of relationships. a continuous set of obligations and memories and small habits, and the particular quality of presence they bring to the spaces they inhabit. Amos Presnell, the original, whoever he was and wherever he went, had severed most of those relationships before the war ended, had been planning to sever them, had been building toward a different life, a different set of continuous relationships in a different country with a different person. The Amos who had existed in relation to Mountain City, to the Presnell farm, to Luella and Jedidiah and Della and Owen Hartley, and the brindle dog named Josiah was already gone before the telegram arrived. And the man who came back, who occupied that vacated identity with such conviction, such completeness, such ease, restored all of it, not as simulation, not as theater, as reality. Luella Presnell had her son for 20 more years. The farm had a steward. Josiah had his person. The relationships were real. The obligations were met. The continuous presence, which is when everything else is stripped away, most of what we mean by a person, was provided. When does it stop mattering whether he really was Amos? This is not a rhetorical question in the case of Amos Presnell. It has an answer, or at least an approximation of one. It stopped mattering to Luella, certainly, the moment he walked through the door. It stopped mattering to Josiah immediately, in the way that things stop mattering to dogs, which is completely. It stopped mattering to Jedidiah sometime in the middle years, when the work of the farm and the quality of the man's daily presence had accumulated into something that the question of identity could no longer unseat. It stopped mattering to the neighbors gradually, as decades have a way of making gradual the things that once seemed urgent. It still mattered to Sheriff Green, probably until he died. It still mattered to Cecil Barton. It still mattered to Willis Slagle and to Cora McBride and to the people who had known Amos well enough to feel the difference, the slight wrongness, the translation quality that Della had identified and that no one could quite name. For them, it never stopped mattering, and the fact of 41 years didn't change what they knew or thought they knew. It still mattered to Madeleine Bouchard in her village in the Ardennes, who had been visited by a man who knew Amos's letters by heart, and who left in the spring of 1919 saying he had to find out who he was. She lived until 1974. Whether she ever found out what he found, whether she ever learned that a man in Mountain City, Tennessee, had claimed to be Amos Presnell, and had lived as Amos Presnell for 41 years, and was buried as Amos Presnell in a churchyard in the southern mountains. Whether she knew any of this, or whether she spent the rest of her life wondering, nobody knows. Her part of the story simply stops in the spring of 1919 with the man walking away and her watching him go. The question of who Robert Estep was, in the period between his escape from the Roanoke Veterans Hospital in July of 1919 and his arrival in Mountain City in September of that year, has never been answered. There is a gap of 2 months. Barton's report accounts for neither of them. If he went to Givet, if he was the man who came to Madeleine Bouchard, the gap is accounted for in France, but getting from Roanoke to Givet and back requires passage, money, a plan that seems inconsistent with the profile of a man hospitalized for acute dissociation and identity confusion, unless the confusion itself supplied the plan, unless Amos Presnell's memories, or the structure of them, carried the destination already embedded, the name of the village, the name of the woman, the year of letters that constituted, for the absorbed version of Amos inside Robert Estep's damaged mind, a home that needed to be found. Or he didn't go to France. Or Madeleine's visitor was someone else entirely. Or Madeleine's visitor was the actual Amos Presnell, and the man who came to Mountain City afterward was the imposter. And somewhere between Givet and Johnson County, the identities crossed in a way that can no longer be disentangled. The iron in Iron Mountain's geology creates magnetic fields that disorient compasses, that make north unreliable, that cause the needle to waver and point to places it should not point. The mountain doesn't know it's doing this. The mountain is simply what it is, and what it is happens to interfere with the instruments people use to locate themselves. In September of 1919, a man walked into a general store in its shadow and said a name, and the name acted on the people who heard it, the way the mountain acts on compasses. Not wrongly, exactly, but in a way that made the reliable instruments uncertain, that made the expected directions refuse to hold. He said the name for 41 years. He wore it the way a man wears a coat that fits him, not because he chose the coat, but because the coat was there and he was cold and the coat fit. Whether the coat had been his originally or had belonged to someone who no longer needed it, or had been woven from both, woven from the grief of a mother who needed her son and the confusion of a man who needed a self, is a question that the sealed envelope at Vanderbilt University might answer if the answer were released, which it has not been, which it will not be. There are 2 graves bearing the name Amos Presnell, one in France, where the white marble crosses march in rows across the lawn of Romagne-sous-Montfaucon, and the American Battle Monuments Commission tends the grass and replaces the stones when they weather. One in a churchyard in Mountain City, Tennessee, where the stone has been weathering for 64 years, and the land around it is familiar in the specific way that land becomes familiar when it has held the dead of a single family across generations. Both of them are real. That is not a paradox. That is the thing that is hardest to hold, that they can both be real, that reality is not so jealous as we want it to be, that the truth of a life is not always located in its biological origin. A man lived on that land for 41 years. He worked it and tended it and was present to the people who needed him to be present. The stone in the churchyard marks that life. Whatever name the life was lived under, however the name was acquired, the life was real. The grief that made the life possible, Luella's grief, which became her certainty, which became the space the man stepped into, was real. The dog knew. The dog, who had no stake in the question of identity, who could not be deceived by memory or narrative or the particular human need to make the story come out right. The dog rose from sleep and pressed its face into his hands. The body knows what the mind cannot settle. And somewhere in France, in the Meuse Valley, in a cemetery on a ridge above the river, a stone stands with the same name on it. It may mark the grave of a soldier who died charging a German position on October 8th, 1918. It may mark the grave of another man, misidentified in the chaos of the worst 47 days of the American military experience. It may mark an empty box. Nobody knows. The American Battle Monuments Commission tends the grass without knowing. The marble holds the name without knowing. Both graves, in their own way, are real. There is one more thing. in the estate of the man who died in 1960, among the possessions left in the Presnell house, a single letter was found, handwritten, never sent. It was addressed to no one. It was dated November 1945, the year the Second World War ended, the year another generation of men came home carrying their own locked doors and things they didn't discuss. It read, "I have lived in this house for 26 years, and I do not know if I ever had the right to. But I know what I have done with the time. I know what my mother has felt in the years since I came back. I know what the land looks like in the first light of a cold morning, and I know what it costs to keep things growing. Whether I was always the man who knew these things, or became him, I cannot tell you. I cannot tell myself. The question stopped feeling urgent a long time ago. The morning keeps coming. The work keeps needing doing. I keep getting up." The letter was found by Sandra Presnell Cole, the granddaughter who would later request the DNA testing. She kept it for 50 years. Whether she included it as evidence in the testing process or kept it separate, whether it was, to her, evidence at all, or simply a document of a life that had been lived, is not recorded. The letter is held now in the Johnson County Historical Society, in the same acid-free sleeve as the two photographs, the portrait from 1917 and the courthouse photo from 1919. When you pull the sleeve from the folder and hold the photographs up to the light, they are so close to matching that you have to look for the differences. The jaw, the forehead, the ears. You find them if you look, but the scar is the same. Above the left eyebrow, a pale crescent no larger than a fingernail, catching the light in both photographs in exactly the same way. You look for a long time. You put the photographs back. You leave the archive and walk out into the particular quality of light that Johnson County has in the late afternoon, when the sun drops behind the ridges and Iron Mountain's shadow reaches across the valley. And the compass, if you happened to be holding one, would tell you that north is not quite where you expect it to be. And you carry the question with you, because there is no place to set it down.